Listed my house on Airbnb while I was visiting my sister in Kelowna. I found out from a stranger standing on my front porch. She had a rolling suitcase and a printed confirmation email. She said her name was Jennifer and that she'd driven up from Seattle for a long weekend. She looked more confused than I was, which is saying something because I was standing there in my driveway at 4:30 in the afternoon with my keys in my hand and absolutely no idea what was happening. I told her there must have been a mistake. She showed me her phone. The listing had photos of my living room, my kitchen, the quilt my mother made, folded at the foot of the guest's bed. The price was $185 a night. I sat in my car for a long time after that, not crying, just sitting. My name is Dorothy, and I have lived in the same house in Penticton, British Columbia for 31 years. My husband Frank and I bought it the spring our son was born. It needed everything. New roof, new windows. The bathroom tiles were a shade of green that had no business existing. But we loved it. We put in a garden along the back fence. We painted the porch ourselves, twice. When Frank died 6 years ago, I stayed. My daughter Miriam asked me to move to Kelowna to be closer to her. My son Kevin said I could sell and put the money somewhere sensible. I said no to both of them. This was my home. The roses Frank planted were still coming back every June. I wasn't going anywhere. What I didn't account for was my son-in-law, Ryan. Miriam met Ryan at a work conference in Vancouver about 8 years ago. He was charming in that particular way some men are. Always had a plan, always had an angle, always made you feel like he was letting you in on something. He sold real estate, not the quiet residential kind, the kind that involved words like portfolio and yield and market positioning. The first time he came to my house for Thanksgiving, he walked through every room with his hands in his pockets and said it was a great bones property. I thought that was a strange thing to say about someone's home. I smiled and handed him a plate of stuffed mushrooms. For the first few years, things were fine. Distant, maybe. Ryan and I were never close. He treated Miriam well enough, and she seemed happy, and I told myself that was what mattered. He had opinions about everything. The best way to invest, the best neighborhoods, the best time to sell, but I learned to let it wash over me. Frank used to say some people talk to fill silence. Ryan was one of those people. It was after Miriam got pregnant with their second child that things started to shift. She was exhausted and overwhelmed, and Ryan started calling me more often, not to chat, to ask. Could I come stay for 2 weeks to help with the baby? Could I lend them money for the down payment on a rental property they were looking at? Could I watch the kids for the summer so they didn't have to pay for camp? I said yes to the first one. I said yes reluctantly to a loan of $8,000, and I wrote out a proper agreement the way my accountant advised me to. I said no to the summer because I had my own life. My garden club, my Wednesday walks with my friend Patricia, a watercolor class I'd signed up for and actually been looking forward to. Ryan didn't say anything when I said no. He just got very quiet in the way that meant he was filing it away somewhere. That autumn, he started talking about my house differently. He'd done this before in passing, but now it was more pointed. The Okanagan market was moving fast. Airbnb was printing money for people with properties in tourist areas. Had I ever thought about listing just the guest room during the summer months? I said no. I didn't want strangers in my home. He nodded like I'd said something naive. A few months later, he mentioned it again. This time it was the whole house. Just July and August, just while I was already traveling. I could stay with Miriam and him, he said. It would be good for all of us. I could contribute to the household expenses with the rental income. I said no again, more firmly. He said I was being sentimental. I said I was allowed to be sentimental about my own house. He laughed like that was funny. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, honestly, was that Ryan had already looked into it. He'd already researched what my property would list for. He'd already calculated the numbers. He was just waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came in late July when I went to Kelowna to help Miriam after her surgery. It was routine, a knee repair, but she needed help with the kids for 2 weeks, and I was happy to go. I packed a bag, watered my plants, left a key with my neighbor Patricia with instructions to check the mail, and drove up the highway. I was there for 11 days before Patricia called me. She said a car had pulled up in front of my house the previous evening, then another one that morning. She'd gone over to ask what was happening, and a young couple told her they'd booked the property through Airbnb. She said she was sorry to tell me, but she thought I should know. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I thanked her and asked her to tell the couple as kindly as she could that there had been a mistake, that the booking was not authorized, and that they would need to find other accommodation. She said she would. I went and found Ryan in the kitchen. He was making coffee and he didn't look up right away. I asked him if he had listed my house on Airbnb. He said, well, yes, he had. He said it like it was a reasonable thing. He said I was already away, the house was just sitting empty, and July was peak season. He said he was going to tell me. He said the timing had never been right. I asked him how he'd gotten access to the listing platforms. He said Miriam had the spare key, and he'd borrowed it to do a walkthrough for the photos. I looked at my daughter. She was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She didn't look at me. I went and sat in the guest room for a while, not to calm down. I was already very calm, which in my experience is not a good sign. I was calm the way a lake gets calm before a storm, flat and quiet and holding everything underneath. I'd trusted them with a key, not to use my house, to water my plants if Patricia ever couldn't. That was the only reason. I'd been clear about that. I went back to the kitchen and I told Ryan that I needed him to cancel every booking immediately, refund every guest in full, and remove the listing tonight. He started to explain that there were penalties for last-minute cancellations, that some guests had already traveled, that I was being reactive. I told him I didn't care about the penalties. He said that was a waste of money. I said the money was mine to waste. He said I was being difficult. Miriam still wasn't saying anything. That was the part I kept coming back to in the days that followed. Not Ryan. I always been Ryan. But Miriam, my daughter, who I had driven 4 hours to help, who I had taken care of through 2 difficult pregnancies and countless sick kid nights and one very dark winter after her first miscarriage, who knew what my house meant to me, who knew what Frank meant to me, who had a spare key to my home and had let her husband use it without a word. She finally said something that evening. She said Ryan had meant well. She said the extra income would have helped them a lot. She said I needed to think about what was practical. I asked her what she thought practical meant. She said I was in my 60s. I lived alone, and the house was big for one person. I told her I was 63. I was healthy. I had a full life and a home I'd maintained for 3 decades. And none of that was her business to manage. She said I was being unfair. I finished the dishes I'd been washing. I dried my hands. I told her I needed to drive back to Penticton in the morning to deal with this properly, and that I hoped her knee healed well. She didn't try to stop me. I drove home the next morning in the kind of early quiet you only get in the Okanagan in July, the hills still shadowed, the lake coming into view around the bend, the light just starting to warm everything up. I'd driven that stretch of highway hundreds of times. I usually loved it. That morning I was running through lists in my head. The first thing I did when I got home was walk through every room. Everything was where it belonged. That was something. But there were signs. Extra towels folded on the bathroom counter that weren't mine. A small bottle of dish soap by the sink that I hadn't bought. A coffee pod brand I didn't use. Someone had been in my home and tried to make it feel like a rental. There was something so strange about standing in the room where Frank and I used to watch the news together and seeing it arranged like a product. I called Patricia and thanked her again. Then I called my accountant, my lawyer, and my bank, in that order. My lawyer was a woman named Susan Brightwell, who I'd been working with since we did our wills. She was very practical and not easily shocked. When I explained what had happened, she said that what Ryan had done was unauthorized use of my property, that it could be characterized as fraud depending on the platform's terms of service, and that I had options. We talked through them calmly for about 45 minutes. Then I called my bank. I flagged the account Ryan had partial visibility into, not full access, but I'd made the mistake of adding him to my emergency contact information years ago when I'd been briefly unwell and Miriam had asked me to. I had that updated. I also had a conversation with my financial advisor about the $8,000 loan, which had been sitting in informal territory longer than it should have. Then I changed the locks. I didn't do it dramatically. I called a locksmith, the same one Frank had always used, and I had every entry point in the house rekeyed that afternoon. I had a new copy made for Patricia and kept the rest myself. I sent Miriam a brief message letting her know. She called me that night. She said I was being dramatic. I said I was being careful, and those were different things. She said Ryan was upset. I said I understood that. She said this was going to cause problems for a long time. I told her I hoped not. I told her I loved her. I told her that loving someone doesn't mean letting them make decisions for you. She hung up without saying goodbye. I stood in my kitchen for a few minutes. The roses were visible through the back window, the last of the July blooms, a deep pink that Frank had picked out from a catalog one February. He'd circled it and shown it to me and said, "What do you think, Dot?" I'd said it was beautiful. He'd ordered two. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about what I actually wanted, not what was practical. Not what was sensible, what I wanted. I wanted to stay in this house for as many years as I had. I wanted to keep my Wednesday walks with Patricia. I wanted to finish the watercolor class I'd signed up for and finally figure out how to paint water without it looking like gray cement. I wanted to drive up to Kelowna for Christmas and be genuinely happy to be there and drive back home afterward to my own bed and my own things. I wanted my children to understand that I was not a problem to be managed. I was their mother, and I was a person. The following week, I met with Susan Brightwell in person. We formalized the loan repayment agreement and put it into proper legal terms. We also talked about updating my will, which had been sitting untouched since Frank died, and which, if I was being honest with myself, had given both of my children an informal sense of entitlement that wasn't doing any of us any favors. I made some changes, not out of anger, out of clarity. I also wrote Miriam a letter. A real one, on paper. I told her I loved her, and I was proud of the woman she was. I told her that I had been too quiet for too long about certain things, and that the silence hadn't served either of us. I told her that Ryan's choices were his to make, but she had a choice too, every single time, and I needed her to remember that. I told her the door was open. I would always answer when she called, but I would not be a passive participant in decisions about my own life anymore. I put it in an envelope and mailed it to Kelowna. She called 3 weeks later. She was crying a little. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known about the photos until after, and that she should have told Ryan to stop long before things got this far. I told her I believed her, and I did, mostly. I also told her that after was still a choice. She said she knew. We talked for a long time that afternoon, longer than we had in years. She told me she'd been stressed about money, about the second mortgage, about Ryan's tendency to push forward with ideas before thinking them through. She said she didn't always know how to slow him down. I told her that was worth figuring out, not for my sake, but for hers. Ryan sent me a text 2 days later. It said he was sorry if I felt disrespected. That was the whole message. I read it twice and put my phone down. Some apologies are complete sentences. That one was not. But I was done waiting for people to hand me resolution before I allowed myself to move forward. The watercolor class ran through September. I never did figure out water, but I got quite good at painting the hills. Patricia came for dinner the second Friday of every month. We'd started doing it years ago, and I'd let it lapse after Frank died, and then picked it back up again, and now it was just one of the things I looked forward to. She brought the wine. I cooked. We talked about our gardens, our children, the news, the particular way that getting older is both harder and easier than you expected. She asked me once, that fall, whether I regretted not confronting Ryan more directly, whether I wished I'd said more. I thought about it honestly. I said I didn't think so. I said I'd spent a lot of years making myself smaller in conversations, trying to keep the peace, giving people room to do things they shouldn't have been doing in the first place. This time I'd done something different. I'd gone quiet, and then I'd gone to a lawyer, and I'd changed the locks, and I'd written down what I meant. Not for Ryan. Not even for Miriam. Not entirely. For myself. Patricia nodded and poured more wine. Outside, the October light was doing that thing it does in the Okanagan. going gold and sideways, hitting the leaves just right, making everything look like it was lit from inside. Frank used to say it was worth the whole year just for those few weeks in October. I'd thought about selling briefly in those weeks after everything happened, just to be done with it, just to not have to look at the guest room and think about a stranger's suitcase. But I didn't. This was my house. The quilt was back at the foot of the bed where it belonged. The roses would come back in June. The hills were outside my window, and the light in October was exactly what Frank had always said it was. I wasn't going anywhere. I still think about Jennifer sometimes. The woman with the rolling suitcase who drove up from Seattle and stood on my front porch holding a confirmation email for a house that was never supposed to be rented. She wasn't the problem. She was just the moment everything became impossible to ignore. What Ryan did had a logic to it, even if the logic was wrong. He saw a house, a market, an opportunity, and a woman he decided was too sentimental to think clearly. He'd been building that story about me for years, that I was impractical, that I was holding on to things out of stubbornness, that my attachment to my home was a kind of weakness, and I'd let that story sit there unchallenged for too long. Every time I said no and then went quiet, every time I absorbed his comments about yield and market positioning without responding, I gave him room to believe the story was true. That's the thing about staying silent to keep peace. It doesn't keep peace. It just postpones the moment when someone finally decides your silence means permission. What I did after, the lawyer, the locksmith, the letter to Miriam, none of it came from anger. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just finally thinking straight. I called Susan Brightwell because I needed to understand my actual situation, not the version Ryan had been narrating for me. I changed the locks because a key is not a symbolic object. It is access to your home, and access matters. I wrote to Miriam because she is my daughter and she deserved honesty more than she deserved my silence. That's what I've come to think of as the real turning point. Not the Airbnb listing, not Jennifer on the porch. It was the moment I stopped managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. I'd spent years being careful not to make things awkward, not to seem demanding, not to be the difficult mother-in-law, and all that carefulness had not, in fact, made anything easier. It had just made me easier to overlook. Getting older has a way of clarifying what actually matters. You stop having patience for the versions of yourself that were invented to make other people comfortable. I am 63 years old. I have lived through things that required more genuine courage than anything Ryan ever pulled off in a boardroom. I know how to make hard decisions and live with them. I know the difference between being kind and being a pushover, and for a while I'd confused the two. The honest part, the part I keep coming back to, is that Miriam needed that letter more than she needed my protection. She needed to hear me say clearly that I loved her, and that loving her did not mean accepting everything she allowed. That took something from me. It wasn't easy to write, but it was right. And right and easy are not the same thing, and I think I'd been waiting for them to be the same thing for far too long. Patricia asked me once if I was lonely, living here by myself. I told her no. I told her lonely is when you're surrounded by people who don't see you. This house, this garden, this particular October light, they see me just fine.